In the Maimer Pada B'Shalom Tafshin Lamed Tes, 40th anniversary coming up on Sunday of this, or Shabbos actually, sorry, Motzei Shabbos. And the Rebbe said this Maimer 40 years ago. And we're going to just review a little bit from chapter 3 before we move on to chapter 4. Chapter 3 has got a lot of details. There are a lot of elements there that I want to try and work through because they're all connected with each other. So just some of the topics that we've been exploring is the idea of peace and what true peace is. So we said that there are 3 levels of peace, right? There's a peace that comes as a result of a difficult war, combat, hand-to-hand combat, where you wrestle with your enemy and you can defeat the enemy. There's a peace that comes from a show of strength, of force, where you can intimidate your enemy into submission. And so there's no actual battle that's taking place. You overwhelm the enemy. Then there's a peace that comes that where there is no enemy. The enemy becomes a friend. So there is no enemy. There's no war. There's no fighting. There's no combat. There is only peace, only friends. So that's what we talk about. Peace that relates to the title of the Maimer Pada B'Shalom. Then to discuss this, we went into a few other things. So we talked about the 5 levels of the soul: Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, and Yechida. The 5 levels of the soul are sometimes divided into 2. There's Naran, and then there's Chaya and Yechida. And then other times they're divided into 3. Like we did in the last Maimer, we've been doing in this Maimer. 3, that there's Naran, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, and then there's also Chaya is another category, Yechida is another category. Okay, we'll get back to that in a second. Then we talked about the fact that, so we have 3 ways to get to peace. Then we talked about the division of the Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama, Chaya, Yechida, of the 5 levels of the soul into 3, right? Then we talk about the fact that, so when we're talking about these levels of the soul, so that brings to mind why we divide them into 2 or into 3. So here we're talking about Makif and Pnimi. That there's something that's internalized and something that's transcendent. So within our soul, we have the 10 faculties, the 10 attributes, the 10 faculties of our soul, 3 intellectual faculties, 3 primary emotional faculties, and 3 secondary emotional faculties. So you have Chabad, Chachma, Bina, Das, that's the faculties of the intellect. Then you have Chachma, Bina, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, those are your primary emotions, love, fear, and compassion. Then you have Netzach, Hod, Yesod, which are the sort of the extension of the application of those emotions to the next step, where the perseverance of these emotions. So you have those aspects. So you have and they're internalized because they are the functions and the definitions of the soul. That's the way the soul feels and thinks and knows. So that's internalized. Those are the conscious levels of the soul. Then you have the transcendent levels of the soul. So you have Chaya, which is Ratzon, which is will, which is a transcendent faculty. It's not a faculty that's internalized, meaning it's not specifically defined. It doesn't have a defined place in the body. It's something that transcends. And then you have the essence of the soul. That's Yechida. Right? So generally you can divide them into 2. You have the internalized functions of the soul and capacity of the soul, and then you have the transcendent levels of the soul. How do they correspond to these 5 levels of the soul? The first 3 levels, Naran, are internalized because Naran, Nefesh, corresponds to the 3 lowest levels of the 10 attributes. Right? Netzach, Hod, Yesod. Then you have Ruach, which corresponds to the primary emotions, the Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes. And then you have Neshama, which corresponds to the intellectual aspects of the soul, Chachma, Bina, and Das. So Naran, the 3 levels of the soul that are internalized, invested in the body, those correspond to these 3 elements of the 10 attributes. Then you have Chai, which is not in the body, that's transcendent, that corresponds to the will, which is a transcendent thing. So Chai is already a level that doesn't enter into the body. And then you have Yechida, which is the essence of the soul, also transcendent. However, we said that we can really divide it into 3. That Chai and Yechida are really 2 separate levels, even though they're both transcendent, but they're different types of transcendence. And here another element, something we've discussed in the previous classes, is liken it to food, which is internalized. You have clothing, which are external. There's something that go around the person and protect the person. And you have a house, which also shields the person, but is distant. So you have, in Hasidic terminology, you have mazon, which is pnimi. Then you have the levushim, which are makif hakarev, a close transcendence, but that's within proximity of what it is that it transcends. And then you have the makif harachik, the distant one, the one that's far away from you. So when we talk about these different aspects, so chaya would be the makif hakarev, would be more like clothing which are tailored to the person. So even though they're outside of the person, but they're still customized for the person. And then you have yechida, which is totally above and beyond. Another thing we talked about is the idea of babua de babua leslim, right? We talked about the fact that that you have, for everything there is a counter. There's one point and there's a counterpoint. And that is, God creates everything that He creates in holiness. He creates a counterpart in the unholiness. So you have, for our intellect and our emotions, there are positive, there are holy thoughts and there are holy emotions. And then there are the opposite. You have unholy thoughts, unholy emotions. Then you have, even within will, there's a will that's a divine will, and then there's a self-interest, a will that's not for the divine. But then you have babur de babur laslo. Why is it so that we said that corresponds to yechida? Why? There's a person, that's your pnimius, right? We talk about the levels of naran, that's you. But then you have babur, the shadow. The shadow is already not you, that's outside of yourself. So there's a shadow, and the shadow, that would correspond to chaya. Chaya being the shadow already being something transcendent, but then there's the shadow of the shadow, right? So there's a distant, yet further removed transcendent element and level, and that's yechida. And we're saying that Gemara says that level doesn't exist in the unholy. So in the last mimer there, but it's not the subject of this mimer, but in the previous mimer we were learning, we discussed why that is. Why is it that there's no shadow of a shadow in the unholy? In other words, why is there no counterpart to yechida? We said because it's mekabelas miyachid, right? Yechida is one with God, and so the only things that have a counter are things that God creates. Other things, that otherness has, there's a holy otherness, and then there's unholy otherness. But yechida, since it comes from the one and only, there's no counterpart to the one and only, to God, and so yechida also has no counterpart because it's an extension in a sense of that. It's an extension of God's onlyness, to which there is no counter. Okay. How do all these things come together? Because we started talking about the idea of war and peace, and we said generally, when we talk about war, you have that would correspond to davening. When we daven, we're in a battle. Like the Zohar says, shas krava. The time of davening is a time of battle, and then you have learning Torah. When you learn Torah, that's peace. What does it mean? Peace and war. When you're davening, the way you influence and transform yourself, your animalistic self, is through battle. And when you learn, you transform it, but not through battle, through peace. How so? Davening is all about hisbonenus, it's about contemplation, about reflection. You open up a siddur, you start davening. The davening is structured in a certain way, and you start meditating and thinking about God as creator and how God fills the world and animates the world and so on and so forth. And that brings you to a certain feeling of love of God. And then you go take it a step further, you start thinking about the Birchas Krishma, you go to that next level where you're talking about higher realms and God's awesomeness and greatness as He's removed from the world and how He still is intimately involved with us. Then you get to Shema Yisrael, sort of the pinnacle where we talk about God's oneness. All of that is a rational sort of meditation where we're trying to think about God, create that space where we can understand and have that resonate within ourselves. So if I want my animal soul to get around, come to loving God, all I need to do is talk to the animal soul in the language it understands. The animal soul understands the physical world, so talk to it about the physical world, speak in its language, its terminology, to explain to it that its real nature is God, that God is the ultimate goodness. So the animal soul that wants goodness or wants something good, something that feels good, something that tastes good, and so on, God is the ultimate goodness. But you need to get down and dirty with the animal soul, you need to speak in its language. Why is that battle? Because hislapshus, meaning that's the idea of hislapshus. We also talk about hislapshus, this idea of being invested in something. So when I'm davening, I need to invest. The godly soul has to invest in the animal soul, has to enclothe itself, as it were, in the animal soul. Meaning, it needs to hear its know what its interests are, what its passions are, and then convince it, direct it it's more effective when you channel that, focus that to Hashem, right? That's battle. Why is that battle? So we gave the example of a court case where you have a prosecutor and you have a defense attorney, and they have to wrestle with each other. They're sparring intellectually, but the defense attorney, to mount a proper case, needs to know what the prosecution is saying. So in a sense, it needs to entertain the thoughts of the prosecution. It needs to be able to explain it. Or another analogy we're giving is of teachers teaching students. If you want to teach your students, and you understand things at a different level than them, so you need to engage, you need to spend time thinking about your students' abilities, you need to assess their capabilities, and then you need to tailor whatever it is you're going to teach to those capabilities for them to be able to understand it. So the teacher needs to be invested, needs to be enclosed within the student in order to be able to teach him effectively. That's a form of engagement. So that's a battle that you transform him through engaging in battle. That's davening. What happens when you learn Torah? When you learn Torah, you're not engaging your animal soul. You're focusing on something higher. You're studying God's wisdom. I'm learning Torah, I'm learning God's wisdom. That's what I'm doing. I'm not engaging my animal soul and debating it and discussing anything with it. I'm operating or thinking, being mindful on a higher plane, beyond it. What happens as a result? The animal soul is silenced. It's subdued. It's overwhelmed by the divine wisdom. So here already, you're not engaging the animal soul. So that's why this is not pnimius. This is makif. This is transcendent, meaning you're not investing in it and clothed in it. You're not engaging it and asking it, trying to understand it. You're opening a light, turning on a light to something, opening a window to a whole nother dimension.
But it's really closer to you because it's higher and deeper.
It's higher and deeper. It overwhelms, but it's still close. You have to think with your own intellect.
You're saying that davening is more of a closer action than
that's why davening is engagement, is battle.
More of the hand-to-hand combat.
Right, correct. Whereas learning is not combat at all.
It's higher, but it is deep because it takes over everything.
It's true, yeah. Well, that's just like you have peace that you get through battle, where there are a lot of casualties, where there's a big mess, and it's a big disaster, and the peace doesn't look the same when it comes through defeating your enemy in wrestling than as it does if you show, fire shots in the air or show, your might, and the enemy automatically sort of is subdued through that, right? That's a much more peaceful way to end the conflict.
People that are machlokes and you're learning Gemara or give arguments back and forth.
Right, but that's you're engaging your mind is engaged in God's wisdom. You're not engaging your own the coarseness or the unholiness of your thoughts. We're not entertaining other thoughts. We're trying to understand God's wisdom.
I think it's not a battle between your nefesh and
Right, right. It's two minds that are engaged in discussing, trying to understand God. But on the contrary, that's the whole point. If I'm engaged in that, it's like my head's in the clouds, right? So I'm operating, I'm thinking, I'm mindful on a higher plane. So if I'm walking down the street and I'm thinking Chassidus, or I'm thinking Sugi and Gemara, and I'm trying to understand it, so automatically I don't see what's going on around me. So my animal soul is not activated here, right? So I could try and say, I'm going out on the street, I don't want to start, getting my animal soul, to start to rage. So I need to work with it, and I need to focus it, I need to channel it, I need to harness it, I need to make it more sensitive, right, and refine it, and so on and so forth. And then maybe, or I can go out, my mind is somewhere else, I don't even know what's going on around me. I don't see what's going on around me. That's a whole different form of it. So you're not engaging it directly, right? But you're overwhelming it because you're occupying yourself with something else. But in the Maimer here, the Rebbe said, our Maimer is based on the Mittel Rebbe's Maimer. And in the Mittel Rebbe's Maimer, he says that these two, that these ideas of peace and war are found also in davening itself. But now, there's another element he brings in here, which is that there's when we talk about peace, so there's battle, that is when you engage your animal soul, right? When you're engaging it, then there's peace. But within peace also you have another level. So he said, imagine we're talking about back in the analogy of the court case where you have the prosecution and defense are battling back and forth, they're arguing back and forth. And then you have a situation where the king walks in. The king walks in and suddenly, the case is over. The guy is immediately acquitted. So here, you're not engaging the prosecution, right? You've overwhelmed, you've silenced the prosecution by the sheer presence and awesomeness of the king. Okay, that overrides the whole thing. However, here too, in a sense, there's still, the prosecution still has a case. It's just that we're not going to listen to his case, and we're not going to consider it, we're not going to entertain it. But there's still a case there, right? So even though that's peace, but it's not the ultimate type of peace. So, getting back to when we're talking about Naran, Chaya, and Yechida, the levels of the soul, there's Naran, there's the way we invest, the part of the soul that's invested in the body that has to engage the body, rationality, thinking, understanding, contemplating, emotions, all those things, reasoning with the body, that's a battle. Then there's the aspect of Chaya, where you're overwhelmed, you have a will for God, a desire for God that's so intense, so strong, that it automatically silences any other desires that you might have, because this desire is so intense. But then there's a higher level of peace, where we talked about before, about Yechida, Babua de Babua Leso, there's no challenge to it, where there is no enemy. So, even though the king walking into the court automatically silences the enemy, but there's still an enemy, there's still a prosecutor. But then there's a situation, I don't know how accurate this is, but I think like if you say like if a guy's being tried for murder and then the murder victim himself walks in the door. So here it's not like, oh, we're not going to listen to the arguments. There are no arguments to be made. Nothing ever happened, right? So that's already another dimension. It's another level. It's another level of peaceful resolution, right? Where there's not even something to resolve. The whole thing doesn't begin. So that's the peace that comes through Yechida. How is this? But as we said, the Rebbe says that we can find all this in davening. How do we see this in davening? Because in davening we say in Shema that we should love God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our might. So b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, the Chazal say all your heart means with your two inclinations, meaning I need to get my animal soul to my evil inclination to love God. How do you do that? By engaging it, by right? B'chol nafshecha, with all your soul, that corresponds to the level of chaya. That there's such an intense, Chazal say, even if it means taking your life, you're willing to give your life for God. Why? Because the intensity is so great that they're even willing to give your life. That's b'chol nafshecha. Then there's b'chol ma'idecha. B'chol ma'idecha is yechida.
That's more than willing to go.
That's even more than we're going to get into in chapter 4. We're going to clarify this idea a little bit more even. Okay, so we have these three things we find within davening itself. That in davening itself, even though we said generally there's davening is war and learning is peace, but even within davening we have these things as well. Because in davening you can achieve b'chol levavcha, which is battle, b'chol nafshecha, which is already like the next level, that peace that happens through chai, where you overwhelm the enemy. And then there's no b'chol ma'idecha, which is activating the yechida, the essence of the soul. Okay, what does this mean? So now we're going to pick this up now in chapter 4. Sorry. So let's just to finish that point again a second. B'chol nafshecha, we're saying, is the idea of ratzon, your will. I have such an intense will for God that automatically it subdues all my other wills. But as we said, I have wills, I have interests, I have desires that aren't divine, right? So the fact that I'm activating and accessing my great desire for God, and that's like all the rage. It's raging very intensely. That'll automatically subdue all other. When you want something, you can get so singularly focused on it that everything else you want goes by the wayside. You don't even think about it. Does it mean you don't want those things? So even by b'chol nafshecha, I've overwhelmed all my other wills, but there's a counter. There's the will of God that's more intense, it's more powerful, and therefore it subdues those other wills. It's not the ultimate peace. B'chol ma'idecha is where there is nothing other than that. There is no counter to b'chol ma'idecha, to that love of that's accessed through accessing the essence of the soul. That's the ultimate pada b'shalom nafshi. The ultimate peace is yichida. So now we'll explain this in a little bit more practical terms, in a sense, now in chapter 4. So Rebbe says like this: we can connect this concept, this notion of Yechida being with no opposition. And so therefore that's the ultimate peace, because there's no counter to that. There's no Yechida on the other side. And so therefore that's the ultimate peace, where there is no opposition. Not that I've defeated the opposition, but there is no opposition. So we can explain this, we can connect it with the concept of Mesiras Nefesh. That as it says, that the koyach of Mesiras Nefesh is because of, it comes from Yechida. Right? This terminology, the koyach, what he says in the brackets here, the koyach ha-mesiris nefesh hu mitzad yechida. Mesiris nefesh, this capacity that a person has for self-sacrifice, comes from his yechida, the essence of the soul. Yeah, this is like this. Why is it? The fact that a person is willing to give his life in order to not be separated, God forbid, from Hashem, it's not because he desires to not be disconnected from God. We mentioned before that will, there's a counter to will. I can have a will for God, I have a will for something else. So there's a counter to will. So when we say let's say this out. Let's do this outside first, then we'll go back inside. When we talk about Mesiris Nefesh, what does Mesiris Nefesh mean? It means self-sacrifice. I'm willing to die for something, right? I'm willing to give my life for whatever. In our context, we're willing to give our lives for God. So if somebody comes and threatens you and says either, denounce God, renounce God, or I take your life. So what do? We choose God, right? And we're willing to die. We're prepared to die in order to maintain our faith and commitment to God. Okay, that's Mesiris Nefesh. The truth is, there's nothing unique about that kind of Mesiris Nefesh. Every human being should have something that they're willing to die for. Right? Martin Luther King said something to the effect of that a person doesn't have a cause that they're willing to die for, doesn't really have a reason to live. In other words, life is really meaningful when there's something that you're willing to give it for. Then you're living. Right? So that's not a uniquely Jewish concept, this idea of Mesiris Nefesh, that you have a cause that you want to die for. So when we say that there's something unique, that there's the yechida, the essence of the godly soul, and that it's that brings about Mesiris Nefesh, why is that so? So the Rebbe explains, it's brought with but the Rebbe really articulates this idea, develops it a lot more, that when we say that a person is willing, it's not that you're willing, you choose to die for God. That I have a choice. I can either deny God or I can die clinging to God. And I choose to die for God. When we say that a person has Mesiris Nefesh, like Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, it's that he's not capable of separating. He's incapable of choosing something else. So it's not that you choose to die for something. In a way, the greatest human expression, maybe the highest a person can reach, is to be willing to die for something. To have a belief, a value that's so great that they're willing to die for it. That's what could be greater than that? Martyrdom is a really very special thing in a sense.
Some people are willing to die.
It seems very altruistic. Right, true. But it seems very altruistic. I'm willing to give my life for something that I think is bigger than me. But the difference is that there it's a choice that you make. I choose. I could choose one way, I could choose the other way, I choose this way. So it's a choice that I make. But when we say Mesiris Nefesh, what we're saying is that a Jew doesn't have the capacity to make that choice. Not that he's not afforded the choice, but that there is no choice. In his eyes, it's not. There aren't two options. There aren't two ways.
People throughout the years that have chosen not to.
Absolutely.
You only hear about the ones that chose to do it. But
Absolutely. The point is, though, that this is a unique concept. And this is something that's completely not human. It's not a human thing that you should give your life for something, right? Be incapable of we're rational human beings, that we can even submit to something beyond our rationale, but that's a choice that we make. Everything ultimately begins with us and ends with us, right? So I could choose to die for something, but the idea that I would give my life for something that I didn't choose, and yet I'm still willing to give my life for it, that's already something. So the truth is like this, that idea is something that requires understanding. How is it possible that a person should have that capacity? How could you do something? How is it possible to do that? How is it possible that you can give your life for God and it's not even a choice? That you don't see any other option? And it doesn't mean that everybody who died al Kiddush Hashem with Mesiris Nefesh, obviously at some level, certainly they had that, they had that experience. Something was going around on WhatsApp, this word about dying al Kiddush Hashem, about how Yitzchak Avinu, Yitzchak was willing to die. He was willing to give his life for God. But he didn't end up actually giving his life. Other Jews give up their lives without desiring to give up their lives. It happened to them. So they have the act, but not the desire necessarily. So you have to combine the two. So you get a perfect Mesiras Nefesh when you have the Yitzchak's willingness to give his life, his preparedness to give his life. Okay, it's actually a Chassidish Avart, but it's not, I think it's, I don't know, it's not such a Chabad Chassidish Avart. Yeah, I mean, I don't understand it well enough. But anyway, here what we're saying is, the idea of being willing to give your life, choosing to give your life, that's not the ultimate Mesiras Nefesh. The ultimate Mesiras Nefesh is that you can't even make that choice. What would be a practical way to see it? If you can, and by the way, it doesn't mean that everybody that's ever given life goes through this process, has to do it. This point will be proved, even if only one Jew in a history did it. Then it's a fact, and it's a phenomenon that we'd have to understand. How does this happen? How is it possible that, let's say, even one person in history, and certainly it's way more, but that one person in history would do this? So you have a situation where you have a Jew who's not particularly observant, who doesn't necessarily believe in God, certainly doesn't practice his faith, and then suddenly he's in a situation where he's being killed because he's a Jew. Let's try and dress it up in sort of a modern expression, sort of a modern way. How would we see this in action? So I think the way you'd see it in action is a Jew who's about to be killed because they're a Jew. This Jew in the meantime is completely assimilated, is not even married to a Jew, let's say, right? He's completely detached. He doesn't show up to shul on the high holidays. He's never put on tefillin maybe even in his life, right? And then the moment that he's being killed because he's a Jew, what's going through his mind? Does he resent the fact that he's Jewish? And that's why, and he's dying because he's Jewish. If even one person in history, and this is certainly, it's documented having happened more, but if even one person is capable of dying because they're Jewish and not feeling any kind of regret for the fact that they're Jewish, not at all resenting God for the fact that he's Jewish and dying because of God, that proves this point. How is that possible? It's possible because because essentially you're bonded to God. And there's no other option, there's no other way.
I have a friend, he does nothing. No kosher, nothing, no Yom Kippur, nothing. Somebody starts picking on Jews, he's Jewish, he will fight.
Right? So
nothing to do with
okay. So the point is that's what we say Mesiras Nefesh. That's what we're talking about Mesiras Nefesh. Not a choice, but something that there is no choice. There is no choice. I'm not making a choice to choose God over something else. So that's when we say that there's the koyach Mesiras Nefesh comes from Yechida, the essence of the soul. That's what it is. Because what's the explanation? Why is it that a Jew could give his life without even having any interest in it? It doesn't serve any selfish need. He didn't live on the contrary. In a sense, you could say him dying for God, it goes against everything he represented his whole lifetime, which is that he's living independent of God. So it's an act of self-denial, not self-actualization. Obviously, we think about life, so you wonder what's before life, after life, maybe it's the end, whatever. But in a sense, giving your life for a cause is self-actualization. I could live my life preaching about a certain value, and then when I'm going to die for it, that proves that point. That reinforces everything I represented in my lifetime. So it's even though you're being guilt for it, but it's a form of self-actualization. But here, you lived your life in the exact opposite way, and yet you're giving your life this way, and you're doing it willingly. Not even regretting it. That's only because of that's activating Yechida. That's Yechida in action. That's the essence of the soul that can't be separated from God. Let's see what he says inside. The fact that a person is willing to give his life, not willing is already the wrong word. The fact that a person gives his life and not to be separated from God, it's not because he wills it, because he desires to do it, he chooses to do it. It's not that he has a choice. Should I give my life or should I not give my life? The ultimate form of Mesiras Nefesh is when a person doesn't even have the choice. Not that he's not afforded the choice by his oppressor, but that it's not a choice that he's going through. It's not a process that he goes through. Based on this, we can explain why it says in many places in Chassidus that the love of God that's expressed in B'chol Meidecha, with all your might, that is Mesiras Nefesh. It's not understood. We say, remember, we said we have three loves that are talked about in Vahafta, right? There's Ava B'chol Vavcha, loving God with all your heart. There's loving God with all your soul. There's loving God with all your might. So Chassidus explains that B'chol Meidecha, with all your might, is Mesiris Nefesh. That's the love of Mesiris Nefesh. First of all, we mentioned before, B'chol Nafshecha, Afilu Meitel is Nafshecha. The love of B'chol Nafshecha, Chazal tell us, that's even if he takes your life. Right? So isn't that Mesiris Nefesh? And the truth is that even B'chol Vavcha, I love God so much, I love him with my godly soul, with my animal soul, I have such an intense love for God, wouldn't I be willing to die for him? And certainly if I love him even beyond rationality, beyond reason, B'chol Nafshecha, with all my will, wouldn't I be willing to die for him? So already with B'chol Vavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, I also have Mesiris Nefesh. I would be prepared for Mesiris Nefesh to give my life for God, even if I just had the Ava B'chol Vavcha or the Ava B'chol Nafshecha. So why does Chassidus say that the Ava B'chol Meidecha, that's where Mesiris Nefesh suddenly shows up? That's Mesiris Nefesh. Right? Even the love of B'chol Vavcha, all your heart and all your soul, also would compel you to Mesiris Nefesh, to self-sacrifice. If you love God with all your heart, and certainly if you love him with all your soul, you certainly you'll undoubtedly give your life for him. Like he says in note 32 here, like Chazal say, B'chol Nafshecha means even giving your life. So I love God with all my soul, and how do I see that? Because I'm willing to die for him. So then what's new, what's now introduced, something new that comes with the love of B'chol Meidecha, that's not already there? How are we doing on time? 2 minutes? Okay, we'll stop here with Ba'i Va'abir. So we'll get into the explanation, God willing, in the next class.